This is a 1990 Mitsubishi Eclipse GSX, and this was the coolest sporty little car you could get back in 1990. It was basically the Subaru BRZ and Toyota 86 of its time, except this car had just as much power as the BRZ in the 86, even though it's almost 30 years old. This is a pristine example of the Eclipse GSX, maybe the last pristine example left, and today I'm going to take you on a tour of it. First, a quick overview. The Eclipse came out in 1990. This is from the first year, and there were Chrysler versions of it too, the Eagle Talon and the Plymouth Laser. Now, there were base model versions of all these cars with front-wheel drive and not much power, and there were mid-level versions, but this is the one you wanted, the Eclipse GSX, which had all-wheel drive, that was a big deal at the time, and a turbocharged four-cylinder with about 200 horsepower. Now, 200 horsepower was also a huge deal back in 1991. For comparison, the entry-level Mercedes SL at the time only had 30 more horsepower than this thing. It was also a big deal because this car weighed in at only a little over 3,000 pounds. The Talon and Laser also had high-performance versions. The Talon's was called the TSI, and the Laser's was called the RS Turbo. All three cars were built together in a joint venture in a factory in Illinois called Diamond Star Motors. The diamond for Mitsubishi's logo and the star for Chrysler's logo. Collectively, the cars were called DSMs. And although a health professional might tell you that DSM is a big book of mental disorders, car enthusiasts know differently. This is a DSM. But there was a problem. Since the DSM cars were sporty and since they were always relatively cheap, a lot of them were heavily modified and a lot of them blew up or were crashed throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Nearly 30 years later, this is probably the nicest example left. So I borrowed it from a viewer here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and today I'm going to take you back to 1990 and I'm going to take you on a tour of the pristine original Eclipse GSX and show you all of its quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road, something I've always wanted to do, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the Eclipse, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer. Now I'm going to start off the quirks and features with maybe this car's most distinctive styling element, and that would be the hood bulge. All of these cars had this off-center hood bulge that was always a very weird thing to look at when you saw one on the street. Now I always assumed, and I think everyone always assumed, that that was because this car had such a giant turbocharger that they couldn't contain it under the hood. Well, it turns out that's not true. Actually, if you open up the hood and look at what's causing it to bulge, the timing belt is there. That's all it is. That's the only thing that sticks up beyond the hood line. So it's not really a giant turbocharger. That's not really a power bulge. It's there to make room for the timing belt. It's kind of a disappointment. Also cool under the hood, if you take a look under the hood, you will find, well, there's no plastic engine cover over everything, but you will also see, if you look hard enough, a couple of little badges that say DSM on them. Just a little reminder of this car's time at that famous factory in Illinois. Next up, we got to talk headlights. Now, as you can see, this car has pop-up headlights, but it's a little bit more interesting than that. If you're driving along and you want to flash your bright lights at someone, you pull the turn signal stalk back, just like in most cars, and then they flash, and you can see the lights that flash are the ones below the pop-up headlights. But if you're driving along and you have the pop-up headlights on, and then you put on the brights, there's a set of brights within the pop-up headlights. So this car has sort of one set of brights for if the lights are off, and then another set of brights for if the lights are on and up, in their up position. Now, one other interesting thing about the headlights, if you have them down, and for example, you want to clean them, you can push a little button inside the cabin to the left of the steering wheel, and they pop back up and they don't turn on. This allows you to clean them, or if it's icy out, you can put them up before the ice comes so they don't stick in their down position. When you're finished cleaning, you push the button again and the lights go right back down. Now, next up, I want to discuss another early 90s trait of this car, and that would be the light bars. I'm going to start with the giant light bar across the front. Now, you can see that the hazard lights are on right now, so you can see that this is the position of the turn signals in a DSM car, and you already saw that the brights were here, the parking lights are over here, but the light bar doesn't stop there. It goes across the entire front end of the car. So you're wondering, what's in the middle? The answer is nothing. It's fake. It's just a piece that looks like a headlight, except it contains the Mitsubishi logo. There's no actual headlight in there. There's no reflector. It's just there to, I guess, continue the theme of lighting across the front of the car. But the light bar situation is even more ridiculous and frankly more hilarious in back. Now, as you can see, the headlights are on right now. The tail lights light up here. These were also the brake lights, and the turn signals are on the corner here. This car has giant turn signals and brake lights like a lot of Japanese cars at the time. And so once again, you're wondering, what's in the middle? Well, the answer again is nothing, except this time it is a reflector, but it's gigantic, and it has the Mitsubishi logo across the entire middle, like one of those 90s Toyota pickups that would say Toyota in huge fonts so you knew exactly what you were following on the highway. Next up, we got to discuss the rear wiper. I just love the rear wiper on this car. This car is such a simple, older vehicle. Modern cars go to so much trouble to hide the rear wiper, to make it as unobtrusive as possible. This thing, not only does the rear wiper just stick out and it sits there and it's incredibly obvious that it's there, but look at the base where it attaches to the tailgate. It's huge, this giant black plastic thing. It's like the size of a softball. They were just like, yeah, stick the base in there. Nobody's gonna care, even though it cuts into the bodywork and it's incredibly obvious. No one would do it today, but back then Mitsubishi figured no one would care, and they didn't. And next up, since I'm talking about the roof of this car, I must now talk about the sunroof. Now, you know how in your car you push a little button and then the sunroof automatically slides back and opens, and it's all very automated and simple? Yeah, not in this car. In this car, the sunroof manually lifts out. It's a glass panel you remove like a T-top. Now, T-tops were pretty common when this car was being built, so that probably wasn't seen as all that unusual, but it is quite a cumbersome process. First, you must unlatch the sunroof in the back. Once it's free of the little rear latch, then there's a separate little pin on the passenger side of the sunroof as sort of a last resort to make sure you really want to remove your sunroof. Then you sort of lift it up, tilt it at an angle, and then the glass panel pulls out. But the fun is only just starting. Back in 1990, every Eclipse was sold with a little bag that was kept in the cargo area where you could store your glass panel if you've removed it so that it can be a sunroof. And they also came with a wind deflector. When you had the sunroof out, you installed the wind deflector also manually, and then that kept wind out of the cabin when you were driving the car. And the owner of this car tells me, if you take out the sunroof and you don't put in the wind deflector, it's a nightmare, crazily windy inside the cabin. The other interesting sunroof-related item you got when you bought an Eclipse back in 1990 was a sunshade. It wasn't a sunshade you pull closed like in your car, you push a button and it whirs shut. Instead, you had to manually install it. It was included in that little bag, and you would stick it in place. It covered the exact space of the sunroof. The sunroof situation in this car was a little bit cumbersome, but hey, at least it had one. The next generation Eclipse, which came out in 1995, solved this problem by just offering a convertible version. Next up, getting inside the Eclipse, we have to discuss the first thing you notice when you climb inside the car. That would be the seat belts. They're just sort of hanging here right now. Well, there's a reason for that. Back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the US government gave automakers a choice. You could either install airbags in your cars, or you could install these motorized seat belts, so I'm going to show you in a second. Now, the seat belts were obviously the cheaper solution, so most automakers did that, and here's how they worked. You got inside the car, you closed the door. Now, I'm going to turn the car on. The seat belt whirs itself back into position right here. So basically, it forces me to put on a 3-point seat belt. I then take the lap belt right down here from a normal position, click it in place, and now I have a 3-point seat belt just like in any normal car of today. Now, when you were done, you turned off the car, watch the belt, I open the door, and it whirs back into place so that I can easily climb out. Again, if you shut the door, turn the car on, the belt goes down its little track to kind of force me to belt myself in from the B-pillar here down to my waist. If you hated this, there was an emergency release. You could press a little button, it would come unbuckled from the buckle along the track, and you could get out of it. But this was fairly standard practice in the late 80s and early 90s, and my dad's Toyota Camry had it when I was a kid until I was 10 years old, and frankly, I remember most of us just sort of learned to accept it. Now, of course, it's considered really weird. The next thing we must cover is the next thing everyone notices when they climb inside the Eclipse, and that would be the driver-oriented dashboard. Now, this car was just coming out at a time when automakers were starting to tilt the dashboards toward the driver to prove that they were making a driver-focused sports car. So it's not that unusual, but the unusual thing about it is the way Mitsubishi went about doing it. Not only did they tilt the dashboard, but look at those climate vents. They just took standard climate vents, normally mounted horizontally, and they sort of tilted them at an angle in order to make them fit onto this driver-oriented cockpit and have them blow towards the driver. Now, that climate control vent isn't the only thing that's angled. If you take a look around the gauge cluster, you will see 6 different buttons, all making a V shape, sort of pointing towards the driver. Now, the interesting thing about these buttons is they're all sort of surrounded by red or orange, so you would think that these are high-performance, sporty-related buttons. This is a sports car, they're the closest buttons to the driver, but actually they control stuff like the hazard lights and the window defogger and the rear wiper and the button to pop up the pop-up headlights and the fog lights and the interior lighting dimmer. They aren't exactly sporty buttons, but nonetheless, they look sporty. Another piece of interior design I always thought was a little weird in this car would be the steering wheel, which definitely doesn't look like the steering wheel in any modern car. Instead, it sort of looks like a modern car steering wheel that's melting. It has a very distinctive look to it. I will also say one interesting thing about the steering wheel, this was a time before buttons and stalks coming off the steering wheel, and so even though this car has cruise control, it's not activated by a button on the steering wheel. Instead, it's at the end of the windshield wiper stalk. This is something you don't see anymore. It's a very strange placement by modern standards, and the way that it works is also very strange. If you tilt the end of the stalk in one direction, it comes on, and then there's a little tiny light on the wiper stalk itself letting you know that cruise control is now active, and then there are various other functions also on the end of the stalk from there. Now, next up, we have to move down to the stereo, which has a couple of very unusual features. Let's start with the fact that this stereo has an aux jack for auxiliary music input. This car came out in 1990. It predates the iPod by like 15 years. How did they know people would want an aux jack? Because back when this car came out, people had Discmans, those like little portable CD players, and you could play your disc and plug it into your Mitsubishi Eclipse stereo, and it would play. And now you can plug in something else and have it play a modern music device. Now, there are also a couple of other interesting things in the stereo in this car. For example, look at all these little switches that say plus minus on them, and they have little numbers on the bottom that say 60, 125, etc., all the way up to 10,000. Now, I don't know much about car stereos, but I will say when you play with those levers, you can absolutely hear differences in the sound quality. Take a listen. The interesting thing is there are 7 of these levers that allow you to adjust various portions of the sound you're hearing through your stereo. It's like your Eclipse factory head unit gave you the opportunity to have your own DJ experience. Another interesting piece in the stereo, it has a light. I'm serious. You can turn on the headlights and then that turns on the lights from the stereo, but you can also operate the stereo's light independently of the car's lights. You just push light and it turns on and off. Next up, moving further down along the center here, we move on to the center console. It's a very nice armrest. It's a rather large center console. The interesting thing about this particular center console is it includes cup holders, which is odd because if you actually want to put cups in there, then you have to drive around with your center console open in order for them to stay put. Otherwise, it'll close on top of them and smush them. It's an odd place to put those things. Next up, this car has a cigarette lighter and an ashtray. That's fairly standard, but this car also has another piece of very tiny storage right in front of the gear lever, and it operates in the weirdest way possible. Basically, there's a little tab coming out of it that says push. You push it and then it opens up. And when it's open, you see that there's enough room in there for, I don't know, a couple coins, maybe one single credit card, a USB stick. There's another interesting storage compartment under the center console lid. Check this out. You can hide something here from the cops, unless, of course, they've seen this video. And since we're in the center console, we got to talk about the gear lever design. Now, in a lot of cars, the gear lever looks sort of like a microphone. It's like the shaft and there's sort of a ball on top of it, and you can move it around. Obviously, you've seen a gear lever before. This one is different. Instead, it has sort of like a C shape, so you can kind of stick your hand right in it and go through the gears. I either like it or hate it. I'm not really sure. I haven't driven the car yet to find out, but it certainly has a very distinctive shape, unlike most other shift levers. It's an odd thing. Next up, we move on to the door panel. Now, there are several interesting things in the door panel, starting with the auto down windows. Just like in a high-end luxury car, this has auto down windows. One touch and the window rolls all the way down, but it operates a little differently than in every other car. You press it down and then it sticks in place. It just is locked down while the window rolls down, and when the window is finished rolling down, only then does it pop back up, allowing you to control it again. I've only ever seen this before on the 1990s Mazda RX-7 I reviewed, so maybe this was some sort of Japanese idea of early auto down windows. Next up, this car has power locks, pretty advanced, but it doesn't have a power lock button. Instead, the way you lock both doors, you push one lock so that it's locked, and then the other door automatically also locks. That was how they did power locks back in 1990. And finally, maybe my favorite item in the door panel. You know how modern sports cars are always trying to get carbon fiber in the door panels to look sporty and lightweight, or at least fake carbon fiber? Yeah, they didn't do that back in 1990. Instead, this car has this nice little piece of fuzzy cloth in the door panel, just this nice little cloth trim piece. Needless to say, this probably wouldn't fly today. Next up, moving back inside to the dome light operation. This car is one of the strangest dome light switches I've ever seen. In every other car, you push a button to turn on, then you push the same button and it turns it off. Every car is like that, Rolls-Royce to Mitsubishi Mirage. In this car, there are two buttons, on and off. If you push on, it turns on the dome light. If you push on again, nothing happens. You have to go over and select the other button, off, in order to turn the dome lights off. I don't know why they didn't think of just putting one button in there, especially because for the map lights, that's exactly what they did. You push it once, it turns it on, you push it another time, and it turns it off. So they had that technology, but for the dome light, they were like, nah, we gotta go with two buttons. Also cool, take a look at these gauges. This might be old school. Modern cars have these screens that show you all sorts of cool readouts, and I admit that's generally better, but just look at this. This is so simple and so easy, and I especially like there's a boost gauge in this car. Mitsubishi knew exactly who was going to be buying these things. Next up, we move on to the owner's manual. Now, for those of you first-gen DSM fans who have never seen an original 1990 Eclipse owner's manual, here it is. It's pretty short, it's pretty simple, and it is interesting to take a look at. The thing I find especially interesting is the diagrams of the vehicle that are shown. For example, take a look at page 51 on the alarm system. It shows you just arm the system and leave. And look at this guy. He's armed the system. I guess that's an Eclipse, and he's just sort of walking away whistling without a care in the world. Page 106 is also interesting. Here are the diagrams for towing the car and also for towing with the car, which you're not supposed to do. One is sort of a cartoon. The other is a very strict warning label, and they both seem to portray the car with rather different appearances. Next up, we got to talk headrests. Now, the headrests in this car are adjustable, which was pretty advanced for a cheap sports car from 1990. Although, if you push the button to adjust them, you will quickly discover they have two settings: down, up, down, up. That's it. Nonetheless, I guess it's better than nothing. Next up, we gotta talk back seats. Yes, this car has back seats, which is a surprise because it's really small, and as usual, I will now attempt to climb into the back seats. I've already moved the front seat forward, so you don't have to sit through that. So now, here goes. Ooh. Well, now that's not so bad. Oh, well, that's a little tight. Now, this works. I can fit back here as long as the front seat passenger is willing to go as far forward as the seat goes. Now, sitting back here, I noticed that there's really nothing interesting in the back seats except for the fact that, well, they exist. So you could drive around some passengers in turbocharged bliss. Now, speaking of the back of this car, one other interesting item is just how much cargo space there is. In order to access it, you stick the key in here, twist, and then it pops open. There's also a little pop thing in the interior. Now you open it up and you'll discover that with the seats down and with the cargo cover removed, it's actually giant back here, and the opening is especially giant back here. This looks like the kind of cargo area you could put a chair in if you wanted to. You could just drive around your chair in turbocharged bliss. Okay, so that's a tour of the 1990 Eclipse GSX. Now I'm going to do something I've wanted to do ever since I was a 13-year-old lying on internet forums about how I had cool cars because I was jealous of guys who had actual cool cars like this. I'm gonna drive it. All right, driving the Mint first gen DSM. I'm so excited. I've never driven one of these in any form of tune, unmodified or modified. Of course, there's not too many left unmodified. First impression, it rides higher than your traditional sports car of today. It certainly doesn't have that sort of low center of gravity that they have in Porsches, and even that they were able to carve out in the BRZ and the FRS. The ride quality is a little bit rough, no doubt about it. It certainly rides a little bit rougher than most, even modern sports cars, I think, are a little bit more forgiving than this. They didn't have any adaptive suspension or anything back in 1990. The car just feels kind of tossable. It feels very like throw it around. The steering is definitely a lot lighter than a modern car. The handling is actually pretty good. There's more body roll than you expect, but it follows quite quickly when you make a shift in your direction. The car is ready to go. It just doesn't weigh all that much, and it's kind of peppy and ready to do its thing. It's so crazy. I can't believe I'm driving one of these, and I can't believe there's a Mint one that even exists. Not only that I'm driving it, but that it exists, period. It's a nice downshift, coming into a corner. Man, it has more power than I was actually expecting. This car is actually a little bit more fun than I was thinking. It's not straight line fast. It doesn't feel like I could drop the hammer and it would just take off and fly. And the steering is definitely lighter than a modern car. There's an on-center vagueness that's actually quite surprising to me. But I think what's cool about this car and what you've lost in modern cars is just how like tossable and little and fun-loving it is. You can just kind of throw it into corners and it just seems like it wants to go and do its thing and whatever you want to do. I don't like how rough the ride is. I don't like how kind of light the steering feels, but the trade-off is that there's just not all that much crap in this car. There's not screens, and so it's just rearing to do whatever you want. I'm gonna go over there, I'm gonna go over there. It's so much fun to just throw around. I just can't believe how sort of like eager and peppy and fun-loving it is. It doesn't feel necessarily like a go-kart. It definitely feels larger than that. The steering feels lighter than that. But it has the feel of like a very small little car that you can just put wherever you want it to go. And you can tell that it's fun. I mean, I'm saying, oh, the steering is light, it's not that fast. Well, it's in comparison to modern sports cars. But even in comparison to like a Camry, modern day Camry, it does feel pretty quick. And the steering is a little bit better than that. FRS and BRZ would sort of run circles around this car, even though the power number is the same. It's just 25 years of technology improvements. It definitely doesn't feel like stable, planted. It doesn't feel substantial like a modern car. Those are things you lose, and as a result, I mean, safety is not the greatest. There's no side airbags, there's no regular airbags. I mean, this belt is like the most advanced thing that it has. But, for a weekend car kind of thing, if you can find the other pristine Eclipse, you can't tell me this thing isn't fun. I'm really impressed with just how much fun it is to steer. The steering is light, but it's just alive, and the car is willing to go wherever you put it, and it's so light that it really feels like you can kind of move it wherever you want to put it. In the end, mark this one down in the surprise category, along with the GT350R and other cars that CLK63 Black Series that really blew me away. This is one of the ones I'm going to go on Auto Trader later and be like, well, are there any of these available? So there you go, a trip back in time to when this was basically the coolest sporty compact car you could buy. Admittedly, this car had some competition. There was the Acura Integra GSR, the Volkswagen Corrado, the Toyota Celica All-Track, but few cars could match the power and the tunability and the value of the DSM cars. These were once common, but I suspect you'll never see another one like this. And now it's time to give it a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Eclipse is nice, but I don't know if anyone would call it beautiful. It's above average and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration, it isn't especially fast. It does 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds and it gets a 2 out of 10. Handling is fine, but there's some on-center vagueness and the steering is lighter than you'd expect. It gets a 5 out of 10. Cool factor is debatable. I'd freak out if I saw a clean first-gen DSM like this, but I know many people wouldn't even look at it twice and it gets a 6 out of 10. Finally, there's importance. This car is personally important to me because
because I always thought it was cool, but it came from a line of a lot of 1990s sporty cars like the Acura Integra, the Hyundai Scoop, the Volkswagen Corrado, the Toyota Celica, none of which really made a huge impact on the car industry. It gets a 4 out of 10, bringing the total weekend score to 23 out of 50. 23 is pretty low considering how much fun I had in this car, which is why I plan on adding a fun factor category later this month. Next up, daily categories, starting with features. It's fine, good for its time, but very mediocre today, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is decent, the seats are nice, but the ride is a bit harsh, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Quality is fine, the engine is reliable, but the interior isn't exactly luxurious, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Practicality is good. 4 seats and decent cargo space earn it a 4 out of 10. Finally, there's value. A really nice one of these can't be more than 10 grand, but good luck finding one. It's a bit slow and old for 10 grand though, so you'd better be nostalgic for it. It gets a 6 out of 10, bringing the total daily score to 24 out of 50. Add it all up and the Doug score is 47 out of 100, which isn't so good, but the Eclipse GSX is cool to me for nostalgic reasons, and in a comparison against other 1990s sports cars I tested, you can see it ranks dead last. But it wasn't meant to compete with those cars, and so it doesn't quite get there, but to me, it's still pretty cool.